Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you. Alrighty, so we've talked about the importance of soil tests, and so now in today's episode, we're going to talk about how to actually take a good soil test.
Well, thank you, Dylan. Yeah, the soil test itself, we've talked about the importance and the things that we can derive from those numbers and how they translate themselves out into the actual fields. But you can't just go out and just take a bag of dirt or a bag of soil and send it in and say, okay, that's representative of my field. You know, you can't just take a shovel, put a shovel full of soil into a bag, send it in and expect to get any kind of information that's meaningful about your field. So what we're going to talk about today is how to take a good soil sample, why it's so important, and why you may need to split your field up into more than one sample based on the type of soil it is when we get across. As you're taking that soil sample, you'll notice, and I'll tell you what to look for, and how you can improve your soil test methods if you'll just take that additional time. You're going to spend a lot of money buying nutrients and soil amendments, and you're going to spend some money not as wisely as you should if you don't have an accurate accounting of what you have on that soil test, and it all starts with that soil sample. When you look at a soil, and we'll just take a number, we'll say it's a 20-acre field, okay? And you want to see what that soil's like. So what we really essentially are doing when you take a soil sample is doing a soil audit. And it's much like going to, going to a doctor and you're going for your routine physical, and he's going to take what? He's going to take a blood test to see how all the organs in your body are working and how they all relay back and forth to each other, and what are you short of, what are really good, what do you need to add, and it can find some conditions that you may have early just by getting it in a normal physical. Well, that's basically what a soil sample does. That soil sample is taking an audit or an accounting of what we have there, nutrients. We extract them off. We know the numbers that we'd like to have them at, the percentages in pounds, where we'd like to get everything to be in the best place for your crop to do its best growing and best producing. So when you say that, we'll talk later about all the nutrients and where on a soil sample the exact number you want to be with your soil. But today I want to make sure that we do a good job of getting a soil to take to your lab or send to your lab that gets the most accurate meaning or the most accurate accounting for what's in your soil. So taking a soil sample really is trying to be as random as possible with no bias as to where I'm going to take samples. I just start in a certain place on that field, and I make a concerted effort to be as random as possible with that soil test.
In this next part of the podcast, Bill's going to explain the strategies that he recommends for taking a good soil test.
So normally we don't like to, the company that I have, B&B Ag Consulting, we don't like taking things, say, from the last 25 feet from the edge of the property, because a lot of times you can get some distortions. Maybe that's where you started your calibration on your fertilizer applications or your soil amendments, and it's not as good and more as evenly spread as it is the rest of the way across your field. So we won't want your soil sample to be biased on what's happened to it in previous to this soil sample. So we usually come in around 25 feet from all corners, and you just take that off as nothing that we ever get really sampling, any of the sampling. And what we need to do now that we've established that the perimeter is not a good place to get your samples, what we want to do is use an instrument. It can be some kind, we'll just call it a soil probe for lack of a better name for it. And it's usually rounded at the end with a handle at the top to be able to push it down into the soil. And there's dozens of different kind of soil probes that you can use. But the key is to know how deep that we want to push the probe into the ground, okay? And that deep is essentially is at 6 3/4 inches. Well, you're not going to always be at 6 3/4 inches, but we would like that soil probe to get into the soil somewhere between 6 and 7 inches. And we'd like to see you take one of those cores, and the probes usually, we'll just say it's about an inch in diameter, so you want an inch in diameter and about 6 inches to 7 inches long. And that probe then needs to be turned over, soil removed, put into a bucket or a receiving element, and then go on and get your second core. We want a certain amount of distance between those two cores, so we have a little bit of variation in where you got the soils. We just don't want you to poke 10, 15 holes right around each other. We'd like you to have them spread out.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about the frequency of soil tests and how many soil tests you should take based on the size of your crop.
I always like to have a minimum of 1 core per acre. So if you had a 20-acre field, you'd want a minimum of 20 cores. Obviously, the more cores you have, the more randomness you get, and it takes any things that might be out of whack, where you might have something that's way too high on something, it diminishes it by quite a bit just by the number of probes that you take. So we try to get a probe per acre. Now, as you go across that field, you don't really want to go in a straight line. You want to weave back and forth. So if I'm going straight down a field, I'll take a core. I might take 5 to 10 paces to the right, take another one, come back maybe halfway, totally random as I go through the field to get as much variation into that sample as we possibly can. That sample is very important because we don't want to contaminate it. Even something which you would think is as insignificant as the sweat coming off your hands, it can actually alter your soil sample, your results when you get those back. We've had things with containers where you've had things like we put them in a plastic bread wrapper, and it can actually have some residual sodium in there. It can have some other residual nutrients in there, and what it does basically is it skews your test results. We want that receptacle, and most labs will send you their type of bag that they would like their soil put into, and it usually has a nice place to write down the information of the person's, the farm, how many acres it represents, and it could be that farm could have numbers for a field, A, B, C, D, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can then put, if it's field 1 is a big field of 100 acres, well, you might have 3 or 4 samples out of it. You can do designate direction. It's 1 north, and then 1 northwest, 1 northeast, 1 south. Anyway, you can put these different things so you know exactly where it is. And then I always say take a soil map with you so that you can then put down on that map what that soil sample represents. And then now we have a nice piece to follow. Okay, here's a soil sample I took. It was on this part of the soil, and it'll all be based and coming back to you on the soil test when you get it.
Now Bill's going to explain why it's important to annually take soil tests using one of his many anecdotes.
A lot of people don't see the value of a soil test. In fact, sometimes I've worked with clients initially where they said, well, I don't know how important this is. And I always like to point out and put it in a terminology or put it in an anecdote that they can follow so that they can understand exactly what I am trying to get across and how important it is to do them on an annual basis. And I'll go back to us humans and taking a yearly physical. But just think if you didn't take a yearly physical and you hadn't been back for 3 years and you went in after 3 years and he wanted to take a blood sample and do some tests because he doesn't have any, would you say, no, I think the ones that were 3 or 4 years ago would be just the same as they are now? It's not logical. It's not logical in your soil either. Think about whatever crop you go. Take something like corn, where you have removed, out here in California, most of our corn is for silage. So you've removed 35 or 40 ton of corn silage every year, And then you've put a winter crop in and removed another 20 to 25 ton of a winter crop. And you've had how much rainfall, how much irrigation water, and you put all of those inputs that you've put into the growing those two crops. It is not logical to think that nothing changed in that soil. It has removed nutrients. Did you replenish them all? And if you did try to replenish them, did you do it at the rate that was effective so that what you did remove from the field can be accounted for? And that's what a soil test can do. I didn't really apply as much of calcium as I normally do. Could be a lot of reasons for it on the farm, but now you see it show up in a soil test that, yeah, I am a little bit short. You can find out all the nutrients that we look for that I talked about and what you look for in a soil test and how to read it. But if you don't have a good soil test to take and get your information from, that's your beginning point. I can't say enough how essential it is.
As Bill is about to mention, he's going to now go into the downsides of taking soil tests.
Now, after telling you how essential it is, I also want to tell you the downsides of soil tests. When you're doing about a 6 3/4 inch sample on an acre, you have 2 million pounds of soil that we're sampling per acre. And if we have 20-acre sample, you have 40 million pounds of soil. Think about that. That sample that you take, and I'll tell you, if you have 20 to 30 cores, you're going to have about a 4 to 5 pound sample. So we're taking 5 pounds of that 40 million pounds, and we're going to say this is perfect. Absolutely is perfection. We know exactly what that soil is. Every part of it's going to be just like my sample. Again, I'm a logical guy, and that's not logical. So what you're getting is you're getting an overall average of that soil. And as you get the overall average, what you truly want to do is look at it. And if you have no further information, this is the only thing I've got to go on this particular soil. You just can't go hog wild and just decide, I'm going to do everything that it says here. It's 100% perfect. Again, not logical. But we can, if we know a little bit about the area, we know a little bit about how the soil's been responding, we can go part way to a solution. And then next year, when we take the next soil sample, which you should do annually, you then can compare. And then if you look at those two and they are very, very close together, now you have confidence that that's pretty representative of what that 20-acre soil that we're, a 20-acre field that we are evaluating and trying to figure out what's best for it nutrient-wise to make it perform at the top of its capabilities. So I've seen a lot of people do some things with soil where they have looked at one sample, they're not familiar with the area, and they give you a recommendation on what you should do. That's just not good common sense. A guy that comes in and says, we're going to do this systematically, year by year. I also like to told my clients over the years that when you go out and get that initial soil sample, it's like getting a baby, and you just take a snapshot of that baby. We'll just take at 1 year old. Just because you have that snapshot, do you know what the baby will look like? 5 years old? 15 years old? 20 years old? You really have no idea exactly how that's going to turn out. And that's like a soil sample. A soil sample is a snapshot, but many soil samples becomes a photo album. And we see your soil grow and improve, or we see some conditions that have changed it that we need to react to more rapidly. And so understanding how important that soil sample is to take and take it accurately, because you're going to spend money based on what I find in that soil sample. So I think since I've always said I'll take the sample and then I know I'll be responsible for everything that's in that. But if you're doing your own, and a lot of farmers do take their own, one of the things that they find is that they get in a hurry. And they're going to spend more time worried about their budget and how much money I'm going to spend in fertility, or how much money I have to spend in fertility, rather than I need to get this as accurate as possible and take the extra mile, go the extra mile, take the extra step, and get it as good as I can so that it really gives me a good representation.
Now Bill's going to explain the importance of consistency within your cores for your soil tests.
After you've got your sample, the other thing you want to look at is how consistent were those cores that I took. And one of the things about being the person that takes the soil sample, you get to see exactly what goes into that sample. And if you all of a sudden notice that this soil is fairly consistent, looks good, and all of a sudden I get into a point where I look at that soil and it's much sandier, or it's got more clay, it ribbons more, it's much has a lot more holding capacity of water, it's wetter than everything. Unless that is a very, very small area, you should go around it, because all you're going to do is skew the numbers on every part of that soil sample that you're doing by putting something that's way too sandy or has way too much clay. Now, if it's a high value crop and it's a significant acreage, say it's a 20-acre field and it has a potential for a really good return to the grower, well, maybe these small areas are worth the extra effort to sample them separately. But at that point, then, when you are at that level, what you really need to do is get on a mapping program where you know your coordinates GPS-wise and actually map out these separate areas, sample them separately, and then on your map you have them highlighted in GPS coordinates, and now you can really put together a strong program. I know there's a lot of places back in the Midwest, and I'm not going to talk a lot about the ability to do variable rates, but that is a very, very real possibility and is done frequently in the Midwest with the spreading equipment, because you're putting your GPS map into your spreading equipment and it's able to change rates, change volumes, just based on that program that you've put into it. It's a little more detailed than I wanted to get into, but just to let you know, there are several products on the market to really refine how you spread things and how you want to sample them. And you can do some soil mapping. Veris will actually lay out the different soil types that you have out there, and will actually show you how to make your own map, and then you can follow that Veris technology with the GPS coordinates and just sample as you need to. So having said that about soils, there's a few other little details. One would be, do I have an annual crop, meaning I actually till this ground? Or do I have a permanent crop, like an orchard or a vineyard? Or even in a lot of cases, you get back into the Midwest where we'll do no-till, and there would be very little tillage done. What happens over time is that really what we call the aerobic zone, and that's that 6 to 7 inches that we want to sample in our soil samples, really is more like 4 inches, because you really don't get much air down below that first 4 inches. So in those particular cases, rather than going 6 to 7 inches, a little deeper soil test, we want to keep them a little bit smaller at 4 inches, because that's really what we want to know is that soil sample, what is the crop able to get to, and it's able to get to the depth of that air can get into the soil. That's something we'll talk about many times. It's getting air into the soil, whether it's from soil structure, whether it's from planting cover crops to improve penetration so we can keep it open. There's just a lot of things to talk about opening and getting in air into that. But as Dr. Albrecht said, we need to build the house for the biology to thrive in. And what is the house that biology thrives in? It's one that's a mixture of soil, the mineral fraction, some organic matter, some soil humus, and then air and water. And that's the perfect environment for a soil microbiology to thrive in. When you're doing your soil sample, that's the area that we want to sample. We want to sample where that biology thrives. It's a crazy amount of activity that's in the soil. If you just go out to any of your fields and you pick up a pinch of soil, what you can hold between your thumb and forefinger, that little pinch holds somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 8 billion organisms. That's with a B, billion organisms. And think that I said there's 2 million pounds in an acre of soil in that top 6 to 7 inches. And how many pinches does it take to make 2 million? So however many pinches is, and it's a huge number, and then multiply that by 7 or 8 billion. What we're trying to do is create an environment so that all those organisms do the maximum amount of mineralization in your soil. And that's why Dr. Albrecht talked about how the microbes eat at the first table, and there's so many things, and build a house for the biology to thrive in, because that really is what we're trying to do, is create through sampling and then amending and then fertilizing. We're trying to create that house for the biology to thrive in. In addition to the biology thriving in that soil. We want to make sure we have a sufficient amount of holding capacity for nutrients to be held. And so we would look at maybe some additions of some soil amendments, and also maybe some compost or some organic matter or some carbon material to create a better house. The one thing about this, adding all these materials, is a soil sample is good enough to basically sort those all out and understand what's on the soil colloid and actually measures it. When you get those numbers on your soil test, I don't know that I've explained this before, but those numbers, when it tells you I have this many pounds of phosphorus, I have this many pounds of potassium and calcium, what those numbers really truly are is that's the number of pounds that will be crop available in the next 12 months. There are more pounds a lot of times. Particularly, I know that there's sometimes your soil test may show you have 500 or 600 pounds of potassium available. But if you take that and totally analyze everything that's in the soil, not just in that probe, you'll see you have thousands of pounds. And yet they're not biologically available to get into your plant. So we don't measure, those aren't really measured on a soil test. That soil test is really specific for those things that will come available in 12 months. And then the key to growing is making sure we apply them in the time frame that those things are growing, that they are able to get the maximum amount that they need to fulfill their reproductive capability so that they can maximize their production level. I've tried to talk a lot, and if I didn't come across that way, I apologize, but it's so important to do this. And I don't want to sound like I've always known everything that I know. It's just a lot of time that I've spent in fields in a lot of different places, but the answers always tend to come back to be the same thing. A good soil test sent to a good lab gives you a good result, which you can then take those results and with your budget maximize what you can put on that'll give you the best bang for your buck as you apply that, and increase production. As you increase production and increase profitability, your next step is then you can fill in some of those things you may have had to omit in that soil test that you weren't able to take care of. There's a priority to the nutrients and what they need and what are more important than others. But at the end of the day, we don't know anything if we don't know what's in that soil. An old guy told me really simply, you don't know what you don't know. And so when you do these soil tests and you get a good response from a good soil test and a good lab, and you apply those evenly across your field, you begin to get confident with what you're doing. So hopefully this will get you to the point where you will soil test annually, and then in that respond to that by putting out the nutrients that you're able to, with one on a short-term vision for this crop and another on a long-term vision for what you want your farm to be. So that's all I've got on soil testing. I think we're going to start soon on our podcast with individual nutrients and what their value is and how they work and what the plant needs them for. Thank you for listening today.
And thank you, Bill, for sharing your knowledge on why it's so important to take good quality soil tests. As Bill mentioned, I believe our plan from here on out for the next few podcast episodes is to go over the individual nutrients in farming. So be sure to stay tuned for what's yet to come. Make sure to drop a like, subscribe, and leave a comment, and always remember to stay curious.